Welcome to True Crime Threads, where we unravel haunting tales from the shadows. Today we dive into the chilling story of a father-daughter adventure that spiraled into a fight for survival. It started as a simple idea, a story of bonding, adventure, and escape from the mundane. Martin, a man with a spirit attuned to the rugged outdoors, loved nothing more than immersing himself in the wilderness. He was in his late 40s, a tall, robust man whose life experiences had made him resilient, perhaps a little too bold, but always eager to share his love for adventure with his only daughter, Mia. Mia, quiet and reflective, was a typical teenager with little interest in the great outdoors. She preferred the comfort of her room, surrounded by her books and digital screens, but she shared her father's thirst for something extraordinary, even if she didn't always understand it. Their previous trips had been simple excursions, weekend hikes, scenic trails, and camping in familiar woods not far from town. This time, however, Martin had something grander in mind. The Rocky Mountains. Remote, beautiful, and unyielding, the Rockies were famous for challenging even experienced hikers, yet this seemed to fuel Martin's excitement even more. An adventure like no other, he said as he proposed the idea. Mia hesitantly agreed to the plan. She trusted her father, after all. To her, this trip was a chance to finally bond with him on his terms, to share in the passion that he held so close to his heart. Preparation for the trip was intense. They spent days gathering supplies, packing tents, thermal gear, and food provisions to last a week. Martin made sure to bring along survival equipment: a compass, a map, a flare, a small first aid kit, and a radio. But there was a shift in the air Mia couldn't quite place. Her father's energy was different, more intense, almost as if he was silently preparing for something more than just an adventure. Still, she brushed off her instincts, chalking it up to nerves. The Rockies were, after all, intimidating, and she knew her lack of experience added to her apprehension. When the day finally arrived, Mia found herself overcome with a mixture of excitement and fear. They set out early in the morning, the golden sunlight bathing the mountain's silhouette in a gentle glow as they drove toward their entry point. Martin's excitement was palpable. He chatted constantly, pointing out peaks, sharing stories of past treks, and filling the silence with his anticipation for the days ahead. Mia listened, taking it all in, half amused by his enthusiasm, half dreading what awaited her. As they entered the dense forest, the world of civilization faded away. The hum of the city and the conveniences of modern life disappeared into the shadows of towering pines and the rustle of untouched leaves. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the mountain were quietly observing them, gauging their resolve. Yet neither Martin nor Mia could have known then that this journey was to take a dark and deadly turn, a descent that would forever shatter the life they had known. The first few days in the wilderness were everything Martin had promised. The air was crisp, the skies an endless stretch of blue, and each day brought new landscapes to explore: meadows dotted with wildflowers, clear streams carving paths through valleys, and ancient trees that seemed to guard hidden stories. Mia, though initially uncertain, found herself settling into the rhythm of the adventure. Her father taught her valuable survival skills, showing her how to set up their tent under the stars, start a fire with damp wood, and use the constellations as a guide in the absence of a compass. She felt a new bond with him, a side of him she rarely saw in their daily lives. For a brief moment she understood his passion for the outdoors, and even admired his confidence in navigating the wild. But on the third day, the peacefulness of the trip started to wane. They had been hiking along a dense stretch of forest when they realized they had strayed from the main trail. The path was supposed to be clearly marked, yet somehow they were surrounded by nothing but trees and thick undergrowth. Martin initially laughed it off, assuring Mia that he could find their way back, but as the hours passed with no clear trail in sight, Mia felt the first stirrings of unease. Martin, however, remained unusually calm, almost too calm. He kept pressing forward, insisting they were close to rejoining the trail, but Mia noticed his gaze was no longer confident, it was guarded. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor, and they were far from any established campsite. Mia's heart raced as she glanced around, sensing a growing isolation in the depths of the forest. The laughter and curiosity that had filled the earlier days were replaced by silence, and the thrill of adventure gave way to tension and doubt. As dusk fell, Mia tried to reason with her father, suggesting they retrace their steps, but he dismissed her concerns, telling her that getting lost was part of the adventure. He urged her to trust him, reminding her that he had years of experience in the wild. Still, there was a strange edge to his voice, a note of irritation she hadn't heard before. The last light of day slipped behind the mountains, leaving them enveloped in darkness, and Mia's nerves frayed with each rustle and crackle from the forest around them. With no choice, she followed him, though her mind raced with fear. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that this was no ordinary mishap in the woods. What had started as a simple detour was beginning to feel like a deliberate shift into unknown territory. As they pressed deeper into the night, a sense of dread settled over her, heavy and inescapable, whispering that perhaps they were more lost than he would ever admit. By the fourth day, the weight of their situation began to sink in for Mia. Hunger gnawed at her, and her limbs felt weak from days of constant hiking and scarce rest. The food supplies they'd packed were dwindling rapidly, and there was no clear source of water nearby. Martin, however, seemed strangely indifferent to the struggle they were facing. His calm had shifted into something else, a kind of tense focus that made him seem distant and detached. Mia couldn't ignore the change any longer, and the air between them grew heavy with unspoken tension. Martin's behavior grew more unpredictable with each passing hour. His face was drawn and shadowed, and he often muttered under his breath words she couldn't fully catch. At times he would suddenly stop in his tracks, looking back over his shoulder as if someone or something was following them. Yet every time Mia looked, there was nothing there, just the dense forest and the silence of untouched wilderness. Martin seemed to drift in and out of his own thoughts, his eyes taking on a distant, haunted quality that she had never seen before. He began acting erratically, picking up their pace only to stop abruptly, scanning the trees with a strange, intense gaze. Mia's heart sank further with every step, each one amplifying her fear. Then, in a moment of growing desperation, Martin admitted that he had left their only map behind at a campsite miles back. The realization sent a wave of dread through Mia. Without a map, they had no real way of navigating the dense, unfamiliar terrain. The safety net she'd clung to, her trust in her father's experience, was beginning to unravel. When she looked at him, she no longer saw the capable outdoorsman she knew, but someone whose mind seemed unhinged, gripped by an unknown tension that terrified her. As they continued, she found herself wondering if he even knew where they were headed. His once protective demeanor had turned cold and calculating, and when he looked at her now, it was as if he was seeing something else, something distant and unfeeling. There was no warmth in his eyes, no fatherly concern. She felt more like a stranger than a daughter, an outsider witnessing a side of her father that seemed increasingly alien. Night fell, blanketing the forest in darkness. Their flashlight batteries were running low, casting only a dim glow on the path ahead, and the silence around them was unnerving. Martin seemed oblivious to her fear, barely acknowledging her growing distress. A hollow chill took root in her chest, the gnawing fear that he was leading them deeper into the wilderness intentionally, with no plan to return. The man she had followed into this adventure was disappearing before her eyes, and in his place was someone driven by something she couldn't understand, a quiet, steady desperation that seemed to lurk beneath his calm exterior. It was then that Mia realized she couldn't fully trust him anymore. A shiver ran down her spine as she considered the possibility that they weren't lost by accident. The man she had once felt safe with now filled her with a deep, unshakable dread. The thrill of adventure had long since faded, replaced by a chilling realization her father might not have any intention of leading them back to safety. As she stared at his shadowy figure moving ahead, Mia's mind raced with a single, terrifying thought: she might not survive this trip. The days blurred into a hollow routine of exhaustion and fear. Mia's worst suspicions were slowly being confirmed as she watched Martin slip further into a strange, detached state. Their supplies were almost entirely depleted, they had no food left, and they hadn't seen fresh water in days. Mia's body was weakened from hunger, her throat parched, and her legs weary from the constant hiking. Yet Martin seemed unfazed, pushing forward as if he were oblivious to the elements taking their toll on them. He barely spoke to her, and his eyes held a distant, unreadable expression, as though he was lost somewhere within his own mind. One morning Mia woke to find Martin gone. Panic seized her. She scrambled out of her sleeping bag and looked around their campsite, calling his name, her voice cracking in the cold morning air. But the only response was the silence of the dense forest. She felt a wave of desperation. If he had left her here, she would have no chance of survival on her own. She waited for hours, her mind racing, wondering if he had abandoned her. Her thoughts cycled through fear and anger, questioning why her father had led her so deeply into the wilderness and then disappeared. She was alone, stranded, and helpless, with no clear idea of which direction would lead her to safety. Just as her mind began to entertain dark possibilities, she heard footsteps crunching on leaves. She whipped around to see Martin, his expression unreadable, emerging from the trees. There was a strangeness about him, a distant calm that sent a chill down her spine. When he finally spoke, his words were chillingly matter-of-fact. He told her they wouldn't be leaving the forest. His voice held no emotion, no regret, just an eerie certainty that sent a spike of dread through her. Mia's heart raced, a deep, sinking feeling pooling in her stomach. Her father's calm declaration felt like a sentence, one that marked the boundary between her life before and the terrifying reality she was now facing. Trapped and desperate, Mia could feel her survival instincts kicking in. She knew she couldn't rely on Martin anymore. In fact, she wasn't sure she was safe with him at all. She struggled to remain composed, pretending to trust his judgment while internally planning her escape. She reviewed every survival skill he had taught her, every possible way out, and quietly gathered the remaining essentials without drawing his attention. If she was going to survive, she would have to do it on her own. That night, Mia hardly slept. She lay awake in the tent, listening to the steady breathing of her father beside her, each breath reminding her of the danger she was in. Every small sound in the forest seemed amplified, her mind a storm of fear and planning. She weighed her options, considering the risks of running off alone in the forest against the terror of staying another night with him. She was torn between the uncertain dangers of the wilderness and the undeniable threat beside her. As dawn approached, Mia made a decision. She would break away. Her father had led her into the heart of the wilderness, and he had abandoned the responsibility of guiding her out. She was no longer his daughter on an adventure. She was just another lost soul in the vast forest. Steeling herself, she prepared for what lay ahead, knowing that whatever the future held, she could no longer trust the man who had once been her protector. Mia's mind raced as she quietly prepared to escape. Her stomach was twisted with fear and hunger, but her determination to survive was stronger than any hesitation. The darkness around her was thick, pressing in as she waited for the first signs of dawn, knowing that each minute she remained in the tent brought her closer to a terrible, uncertain fate. She had no illusions left about her father. The man she once trusted had become a stranger, someone whose actions and intentions she could no longer predict. The wilderness around them was dangerous, but the real threat lay within their small campsite, in the quiet breathing of the man lying just a few feet away. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Mia saw her opportunity. She gathered her small pack, quietly securing the few items she could find: a flashlight, the remains of the first aid kit, and a half-filled water bottle she had hidden for emergencies. She stepped out of the tent, the morning air icy against her skin as she cast one last look toward her father, still sleeping soundly. With silent steps, she turned and moved through the forest, her heart pounding in her chest with a mixture of fear and resolve. She walked quickly, hoping to put as much distance between herself and Martin as possible, praying she could find her way out of this vast, hostile wilderness alone. But she hadn't gone far when she heard a rustling behind her. Her heart froze, and she turned to see Martin, fully awake, his eyes locked onto her with a dark, furious intensity. His calm composure was gone, replaced by a barely concealed anger that sent chills down her spine. He knew she was trying to escape. She broke into a run, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she weaved between trees, the branches scratching at her arms, her legs stumbling over the uneven ground. Behind her, she could hear his footsteps, steady and relentless, as he closed in on her. It was a pursuit that felt inevitable, a cat-and-mouse game that Mia knew she might not survive. The forest became a blur as she sprinted, her only thought being to stay ahead, to survive. But Martin was faster, stronger, and as he caught up to her, he reached out, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her back. She fought with every ounce of strength she had left, kicking, thrashing, anything to break free, but his grip tightened. The man who had once been her protector now loomed over her as a predator, his eyes cold and unyielding. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, as if bearing witness to a tragedy unfolding within its shadows. In the ensuing struggle, Mia's survival instincts took over completely. Her mind and body moved in unison, driven by the raw, desperate will to live. She reached for the small flashlight she'd tucked in her pack and swung it toward Martin with all her remaining strength, the force of her movement pushing her to the edge of exhaustion. The blow connected, stunning him for a brief moment, enough time for her to wrench herself free and scramble to her feet. Without a second glance, she turned and ran again, knowing this was her only chance. Hours later, Mia stumbled out of the dense forest, her clothes torn, her body covered in scratches and bruises. Disoriented and barely able to walk, she made her way to a nearby trail where she was eventually found by a group of hikers who alerted the authorities. She was brought back to civilization, her survival nothing short of miraculous. The story she would tell in fragments revealed the unimaginable, the betrayal, the terror, the fight for her life against the very person who had once been her entire world. When authorities returned to the forest to search for Martin, they found no trace of him, only the scattered remnants of a campsite abandoned in the depths of the wilderness. Some speculated he might have disappeared into the woods, intent on evading capture. Others believed that the forest had claimed him as its own. For Mia, though, the nightmare was over, yet its scars would remain, a haunting reminder of a father's descent into madness and a daughter's survival against all odds. The journey that was supposed to bring them closer had instead shattered them, leaving only a chilling tale of betrayal and survival in the unforgiving heart of the wild.